Hello and welcome to the Starting Death Guard series, the series in which we go from your first purchase to your first 2,000 point army list and everything in between for the Death Guard faction. For those who are new to the channel, in these series, we begin each series with a video where we look at what you should buy first and what you should potentially avoid as a new player just getting into the faction. After that, we'll take a look at the special rules and different unit types within the army, and finally conclude with different lists for different point builds, looking at some creative, budget, and even tournament lists throughout the process, and as such, it hopefully will paint a complete picture of what the faction can do and what directions you can take it in. To begin with the Death Guard are a faction that is composed of very elite units. However, even though most of their units are incredibly high in points and are very elite in nature, they do have the option of bringing quite a few models to the table that is hard to match thanks to their poxwalkers. So if you're interested in an army that is incredibly elite in most cases, while still being able to, in situations, bring a massive swarm of models to the table, then the Death Guard may very much appeal to you. Additionally, for me, the Death Guard aesthetics are not something I personally prefer. However, after working on some of their models and looking at some of their other models, I'll definitely say that even though the concept behind them isn't something that is exactly incredibly appealing to me, their models are very nice and very well made, and they were very fun to work with, allowing me to experiment with some paint schemes that I otherwise wouldn't. Now, to continue on to the subject matter of this video, let's look at what we can buy in terms of the Death Guard forces. For every army, I always recommend looking at the start collecting or combat patrol boxes, as usually those boxes will provide a great amount of value. That being said, with the Death Guard, I'm a little bit torn on their combat patrol box, which is the only option they really have at this time that's still in print, although they do have some older boxes that are no longer being produced by Games Workshop, so if you can find them, they're definitely an interesting thing to pick up, but I don't really want to cover them simply because of how rare they become over time. Now let's look at what you get within the combat patrol box for the Death Guard forces. The first thing you get is your HQ choice, which is Typhus, who would normally run you $40. The second is a Biologist Putrefier, which would run you $30 if bought separately, and you get a unit of Plague Marines, which would cost $50 by themselves, as well as 3 units of Poxwalkers composed of 10 Poxwalkers each. These would run you $35 per unit if you bought them off the Games Workshop website. However, if you go on eBay, you can definitely find them for less, for about $25 for a unit of 10 of them if you're looking to save some money. So in total, if you bought everything individually within this box set, it would cost you $225, while the Combat Patrol box only costs a total of $140, so you'd be saving $85, or if you went online and bought the Poxwalkers off of eBay, it would cost you only $195, so you'd be saving $55 in that case. So on the low end, you can think of it this way: you're essentially getting the Typhus model for free, and you can always pick up a Demon Prince to replace him if you want something interesting, which would bring up the cost of the box and the Demon Prince to a total of $180, meaning that you're still coming in better than if you bought everything individually by buying this box, and you get a decent amount of models, which is always nice. What really hurts this box in my opinion, and I think I'd be a lot more keen on the Combat Patrol box if it had a more interesting centerpiece than Typhus, because Typhus is kind of a small model, all things considered, and all you're really getting is troop choices. Additionally, the Biologist, while being rather good in itself, is usually a secondary choice to a Foul Blight spawn, so as such you're getting a rather expensive model that you might not end up wanting to play anyway because there's a better choice for that position in the forces, so once again it's a little bit of a bummer in that sense. I'd also like to add that the mix of Plague Marines and Poxwalkers is a bit awkward, as both are playable in the same list, but starting out having so many Poxwalkers is a little daunting, though if you do like the Poxwalker models, they're a great unit to have and will do very well for you. It's just that as a new player, sometimes starting with that many models and having to build and paint all of them is kind of extreme, considering how easy it is to build a list out of very few models within the Death Guard faction. As a whole, maybe I'm wrong, but I would say this much: to many new players starting out, I don't think a zombie swarm is something that's exactly exciting compared to having a large centerpiece model like many other armies get within their Combat Patrol or Start Collecting box. So let me ask you this, and maybe you can answer in the comments if you're watching this: do you think you'd be more excited about this product if it had a big tank in it, or something that could be a little beefier, as opposed to having a Typhus and a bunch of Poxwalkers in it? Because personally for me, that would make the product way more attractive, though once again I'd like to say you are saving a decent amount of money by buying this, and you'll probably want the Poxwalkers at some point, while the Plague Marines and the Biologists are perfectly playable, though the Typhus model is probably very underwhelming and you'll probably end up shelving it rather early. However, considering the savings that you're getting, it's still well worth the price at the end of the day, even though it's a Combat Patrol box that's a little bit more of a mediocre choice than something that's really exciting. So now that I've said that, let's look at a couple model groups that will get you to 500 points for roughly the same price and give you some more interesting units to work with early on. And as mentioned previously, the nice thing about the Death Guard is they're a rather elite army, meaning it's really easy to fill up those points with a small amount of models if you're looking to have some very centerpiece models when you're first getting into the army. So if you're looking for something a little more exciting than that Zombie Horde, or a Zombie Horde with large Demon Prince leading it, let's look at some more elite and armored options that you can pick up and build a 500 point list rather quickly. One thing I'll say is that none of these suggestions are a list in themselves. It's more just a way to get brainstorming with models you can buy to add up to a certain amount of points for a certain amount of price, because once we get into the 500 point list videos, we'll be looking much more in depth in terms of how the list plays together as a cohesive force, as opposed to just picking up some models just to have fun with to start off with, as we're doing here. So remember, none of these choices are optimized, they're just something to think about. The first batch of models you can probably pick up to make a 500 point list rather quickly is a Lord of Contagion or a Lord of Virulence. Either one will do, and both of them will cost you about $35. A box of Plague Marines will cost you $50, and a box of Poxwalkers that'll run you between $25 to $35 depending where you buy them. And in addition to that, to wrap up the list, you can buy a box of Blightlord Terminators, which will run you $60. In total, this adds up to $170 to $180, and if you want, you can probably even drop the Poxwalkers altogether by simply including more special weapons and more Plague Marines within that squad, which will drop the price of all of these models to $145, which is essentially what you'd be paying for that Combat Patrol box, which you can pick up in the future anyway, and essentially add to the force that you're looking at here, because all those options are very playable together. Although, if you do go with this choice without the Poxwalkers, you're only getting a total of 13 models, and that only goes up to about a total of 23 models when you do include the Poxwalkers, so do keep that in mind because this is a very tight list, and it does show you how expensive some of the units can be, because the majority of those points are eaten up by those Blightlord Terminators. Now another option you can go with is something like a vehicle list, where you can pick up that Lord of Virulence or Contagion, then you can pick up a box of Poxwalkers, a box of Death Shroud Terminators for $60, and a Plagueburst Crawler for a total of $65. The total cost of this will end up running you $185 to $195 depending on what you pay for those Poxwalkers, but it is a really bulky list that gives you an awesome centerpiece of that Plagueburst Crawler. You can also drop that Lord of Contagion or Virulence, and maybe take a Malignant Plaguecaster along with 6 more Poxwalkers, which gives you more units on the table to back up your power units. One thing to keep in mind though is that the Death Shroud Terminators are less common than the Blightlord Terminators currently, and you'll usually see both of them in the same list. However, you'll definitely be taking more Blightlords than you'll be Death Shrouds in lists overall, so do keep that in mind in this situation. But the problem is that the Blightlords would eat up too many points to be taken alongside a Plagueburst Crawler, even with just the Poxwalkers as your troop choice. That's actually kind of a bit of an issue with Death Guard, is that it's very hard to build a balanced 500 point list because you eat up the points so quickly that usually you'll end up with one power unit and then a bunch of Poxwalkers supported by some kind of HQ choice, as opposed to a mix of different vehicles and things like that. Though at the same time, the Plagueburst Crawler does look really cool, and it's one of the more powerful units within Death Guard, so it's never a bad choice to go with. Now let's shift gears a little bit and look at things that you can buy in general when you're starting out, because they'll be good in almost any list. As already covered, the Blightlords, Death Shroud, Plagueburst Crawlers, and Poxwalkers, as well as Plague Marines, are great pickups for any list, and if you're looking to buy the Plague Marines and Poxwalkers specifically, the Combat Patrol box is definitely a good choice for that. On top of all of that, the Foul Blight Spawn is a great choice overall, and the Tallyman isn't far behind, with the Malignant Plaguecaster being a good choice as well. That fills an HQ choice for the least amount of points possible, while still being very powerful. Though even then, I would like to remark that even though the Plaguecaster is considered the cheapest Death Guard HQ choice, it is still one of the more expensive HQ choices when compared to other armies, as it'll run you about the same amount of points as a mid-range HQ choice within a different faction. But once again, the Death Guard are incredibly resilient and incredibly powerful for every model that they bring. Now after those units, I would say there are some units that are a maybe purchase, and the first of those maybe units is the Bloat Drone, as it has seen some amount of play that's been interesting, especially with the Flesh Mowers. The one thing that's a hindrance to this model is that it's expensive in both points and cash, but if you like the model, it's definitely playable and it's definitely an interesting model to have. It's just a little bit more fringe comparatively to other choices that I mentioned previously. Now after the Bloat Drone, there's a unit that I'm a bit hesitant to place here, but I think it's interesting, so I decided to put it here, and that's the Mephitic Blight Hauler. The difficulty with this model is that it's not bad in terms of stats and has a very low cost kit at only $25 for each individual Blight Hauler, but it's overcosted in points. If this unit sees a points reduction to take it from 140 points to 125 points, I think it would be very viable, though right now it fills about the same amount of points as a minimum squad of Death Shroud Terminators, which is incredibly awkward considering what it does bring to the table. Though as a whole, if you're looking for a vehicle style of play, this is definitely an interesting unit to pick up and can be a lot of fun, and considering how inexpensive it is in terms of dollar cost, it's not bad to own because it is a unique model, and the fact is that Games Workshop has been updating points rather consistently, so there's a good chance that it will see a points reduction sometime in the future if it continues to be rather weak within the tournament scene, as it currently is, because I think they'll want to balance it so that it's more in line with some of the other choices, and being 125 points, if that does happen, is a great place for this unit to be, and doesn't really require that much of a point reduction to get to that level. Now one last thing I'll put in the maybe category is the Combat Patrol box. As covered, it's a really decent value, but it's missing that thrill factor, and outside of the troops, it's just okay, and Typhus is rather mediocre considering how many points he costs when you can just pick up a Demon Prince at the same points and about the same dollar cost while getting a much more interesting model to work with. It's still a good value and you can buy it and then then supplement it as you expand your forces, because this does give you a good amount of troops that you will want at some point, which is great, but it's not as obvious a purchase as others start collecting kits and combat patrol boxes that other armies have that give you insane value. It's just a good value, and I think that's the biggest issue with it. You do get a lot of things out of it, you do get a lot of models, you get it for a good price. It's just that some of the centerpiece models within it are a bit underwhelming, and as a whole, it's not as impressive as some of the other boxes. Though once again, it's still a very good value, and this is why I'm having such a difficult time pinning down what I actually think about this box, because there's a lot of good aspects to it, and there's a lot of mediocre ones, though the price does keep it at a level where I think it's still worthwhile. Now that we've looked at the units that you should buy, the units you might want to buy, let's look at the units that you should probably avoid. The first unit on this list will probably surprise a lot of people, but I'll explain why it's on here, and you'll probably understand what I mean by this. The first unit to avoid is Mortarion, but the reason to avoid Mortarion has a really big asterisk next to it, because Mortarion is a very powerful unit that can go into a ton of different lists, but he does skew the list that he's in, and if you're looking to make a 500 point army, he's not very viable for that for obvious reasons. If on the other hand you're buying a large army right at the start, that's let's say between 1500 to 2000 points, he's a rather good unit you should consider, but shouldn't feel obligated to buy because lists without him have placed in events. That being said, he's an awesome model and he's a very strong unit, so do give him consideration. It's just that he's not the best first purchase, and he's a better purchase to make as you're expanding your army above that 1000 point mark. I'd also avoid a lot of the generic chaos stuff that transitions to the Death Guard, as most of it doesn't quite do enough in comparison to the truly better units that are unique to the Death Guard. A great example of something to avoid outright is the Chaos Cultists, who have the same points cost as the Poxwalkers, but are just significantly worse than the Poxwalkers overall, so there's really never a situation currently where you want those Chaos Cultists over the Poxwalkers if you have the choice between taking one or the other. On the other hand, something from the Chaos side that's probably on the cusp of playability and has had some discussion but hasn't really shown up in tournaments is the Hellbrute and the Defiler, but both probably do fall behind a lot of the engines unique to Death Guard, and in other cases things like the Blight Lords do fill a similar role while being a bit more robust and giving you a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you build things. So if you really enjoy something like the Hellbrute, don't be afraid to buy it, but do understand that you're going to be a bit on the back foot in comparison to someone who picked up something like the Plague Burst Crawlers or simply Blight Lord or Death Shroud Terminators. So that's kind of the issue with some of the Chaos stuff. It just doesn't do quite as much as the Death Guard options, and in some cases like the Chaos Cultists, they are incredibly weaker than the Poxwalkers, who are just significantly better in almost every way. There are going to be very fringe situations where the Chaos Cultists do outperform the Poxwalkers, but those will be few and you'll generally be happier with the Poxwalkers. Anyway, thank you for watching, and whether you're a Death Guard player or not, what's your favorite Death Guard unit? For me, it's between the Mephitic Blade Hauler and the Plague Burst Crawler probably, as both of them are very interesting models that I really enjoy, and I think both of them bring an interesting centerpiece to the Death Guard that makes the faction really stand out in comparison to other armies, but I'm also a bit of a sucker for big tanks. If you've enjoyed the content, please like, subscribe, and share, as it really does help the channel out, and it helps other players out by introducing them to something that can guide them through the process of building an army, as Warhammer 40k can be a rather complicated game. As always, I'd like to thank my patrons for supporting the channel. They're awesome people, and as always, whether you're a patron or not, have a great day. See you later. Bye.